The storm drain carried the hollow sound of trickling water echoing off damp stone walls. In its shadows, a shape lay pressed against the earth, large, silent, and heavy with fatigue. At first, it looked like part of the muddy embankment itself, a mass of fur matted by damp soil and storm water. But then a faint breath rose, shallow and irregular, stirring the air with the scent of life hanging by a thread. A lion had fallen into the drain, trapped in its narrow confines, his body pinned by exhaustion more than by walls. The lion's mane clung in dark, sodden strands, tangled with grit and fallen leaves. His flank rose and fell unevenly, each breath drawn as though through stone. His head rested flat against the curve of the ground, eyes half-lidded, tracking light as it moved along the lip of the drain above him. He did not stir at the sound of water dripping from the broken gutter overhead. He did not move when a bird called sharply nearby. Stillness, broken only by the faint tremor of a tail-tip against the earth, defined him. The drain itself was a cruel trap. Its sloping concrete walls gave no grip, no ledge for claws. Water gathered in shallow puddles where earth had been dragged in by the storm, spreading cold dampness beneath his body. The air smelled of iron and moss, of a place not meant to hold life. And yet life was here, clinging to silence. It was not long before distant steps reached the edge above. A pair of rangers, walking the reserve in the early hours after rain, paused at the sound of something low and strained, a noise not belonging to stone or water. Looking down, their breath caught at the sight below. A lion, full-grown and regal in any other place, lay diminished within the narrow channel, strength drained as fully as the water had drained from the fields into this hollow trap. The men said nothing at first. They only watched, letting their eyes adjust to the dimness, letting the truth of what they saw settle into their minds. One of them finally lowered his voice to a murmur, as if speaking in a church. "He's alive." The words did not echo. They hung, heavy with both relief and worry. The lion shifted at the sound, ears twitching faintly toward the voice. His body tensed, not with energy but with the instinctive unease of a creature too weary to defend himself. His claws curled weakly against the floor, scraping the grit but finding no purchase. He lifted his head only an inch, eyes reflecting a dull glimmer of light, then let it fall again. For the rangers, that single movement was enough to understand the weight of the moment. This was not simply an animal at rest, nor a lion choosing shelter. This was survival, pared to its last edge. They knew that if he had remained undiscovered even a few more hours, the silence might have swallowed him entirely. The air was thick with waiting. Each sound carried into the drain seemed magnified. The dripping water, the faint buzz of insects along the wet stone, the measured breaths of the men above. The lion's chest rose once, twice, then paused as though unwilling to continue. But then, with visible effort, it lifted again. His body, though exhausted, still obeyed the most fundamental rhythm of life. The rangers crouched at the rim, careful not to cast long shadows across him. They studied the angles of the drain, the slickness of the walls, the impossibility of any self-escape. One spoke again, so softly it could have been mistaken for thought. "We'll help you, boy." His voice was steady, low enough not to stir panic. The lion's only reply was the flick of his tail and the long blink of an eye that opened halfway, then closed again. Yet in that gesture there was no rejection, only weariness. The men stepped back from the rim, but their gaze never left the hollow below. They did not yet move to act. There would be time for ropes and careful plans. First, there was this, the stillness of discovery, the fragile recognition of life where none was expected. They knew that every choice from this moment would carry weight. A wild lion was not meant for touch, not meant to feel the presence of people so near. And yet, for him to leave this place alive, they would have to come closer. Above the drain, the clouds broke for a moment, and light spread across the wet concrete, spilling down to touch the lion's mane. It caught in the damp strands like fire struggling against ash. For a brief second, the shape of him seemed to rise out of the shadows, reminding them of the strength hidden within this still frame. The drain returned to its silence, and the lion lay unmoving, caught between the pull of the earth and the promise of air above. The men lingered at the edge, hearts steadied by the quiet knowledge that they had found him in time. The true struggle was yet to begin, but the miracle had already taken its first shape. A breath, fragile but present, refusing to stop. The air around the drain had grown quiet, as if the land itself waited. The lion remained curled against the damp floor, his chest rising with effort, each breath shallow and uncertain. Above him, new footsteps pressed into the softened earth, careful and measured. 2 more rangers had joined the first pair, drawn by the call for help. They spoke in low tones. Their words carried more by intent than by sound, a rhythm of calm meant as much for themselves as for the animal below. The men leaned forward to look into the hollow, their eyes tracing the slow rhythm of the lion's breathing, the dull sheen of mud clinging to his mane, the heavy slump of his shoulders. His body told the story before any words could. A creature trapped not only by stone but by exhaustion. One ranger raised his hand gently to still the others, signaling that any sudden sound might push the lion further into panic. But there was no roar, no lunge, only the faint twitch of an ear, a flick of a whisker damp with rain, and the weary blink of eyes that followed them as shadows moved along the rim. The group crouched in silence for several moments, measuring distance, measuring risk, and measuring the fragility of life stretched thin. They saw the way the lion's ribs lifted sharply, the way his tail moved once and then stilled, the way his head rose briefly before falling back against the stone. Each detail deepened their quiet urgency, but still, none rushed. In these moments, time moved differently, not in minutes or hours, but in breaths counted carefully between man and animal. One of the rangers shifted, lowering a coil of rope to his feet. He did not yet touch it, only prepared it, letting its weight rest steady in the grass. His companion whispered, "Easy now," though the words were not directed to the lion so much as to the team, an anchor in the thick air of tension. The lion's eyes moved again, slow but deliberate, following the slight movement of hands above. His ears flattened for a heartbeat, then lifted weakly, uncertain. His body did not rise, but the tremor of muscle along his flank betrayed a watchfulness that had not left him despite his fatigue. He was aware of them, of every shift, every breath that belonged to something foreign above him. The rangers recognized this fragile balance. They knew that trust was not theirs to claim. It would be given, or not, by the lion himself. For now, they offered space. One remained kneeling at the rim, his gaze soft but unbroken, while the others stepped back a few paces, lowering their presence in the lion's view. The animal blinked again, his breath pulling shallowly, then letting go in a sound just above a sigh. The morning air thickened with warmth as the sun began to break through thinning clouds, sending threads of light across the wet earth. Dust rose faintly with each step the rangers took, settling again as though nothing dared disturb the fragile stillness. Birds perched on nearby acacia branches called once, then hushed, leaving the moment untouched. The lion's body shifted slightly, his forepaw dragging along the stone, claws glinting with moisture. He attempted to raise his head again, managed a few inches, then lowered it slowly back to the earth. His movement carried no aggression, only the weary insistence of life still choosing to try. The men watching held their breath until his chest rose once more, confirming what mattered most. One ranger exhaled softly. "He sees us," he murmured, the words spoken like a truth already known but finally named. And indeed, the lion's gaze lingered, steady in its weakness, following the outlines of the figures above as if weighing whether their presence meant danger or hope. The decision before the men was not a matter of strength, but of respect. They could not force him, could not drag him. not without harm that would cut deeper than the drain itself. Their only path forward was patience, a careful approach, measured not in minutes but in gestures. Every glance, every shift of the rope, every pause in breath would shape what came next. The lion, for now, remained still. Yet the stillness was no longer empty. It was alive with the quiet dialogue of eyes meeting across distance, of human steps halted in deference, of a wild heart too weary to resist but not yet ready to surrender. The choice to intervene, once a thought, had become certain, and so the rangers prepared, slowly, deliberately, each action wrapped in silence. In the drain below, the lion blinked once more, a long, unhurried closing of his eyes. When they opened again, his gaze did not flinch. He had not given trust, not yet, but neither had he turned away. The moment hung between them, fragile as dew on morning grass. The men remained still at the edge, aware that the first step toward rescue had already begun. Not with rope or force, but with patience, and the soft weight of understanding shared in silence. The rangers stood in quiet agreement, their movements deliberate, their voices hushed. The decision to act had been made, not in haste, but in the slow recognition that the lion's strength would not outlast the day. One of them uncoiled the rope, letting it rest across his palms. Its fibers were coarse, smelling faintly of dust and rain, yet in this moment it carried the weight of hope. He lowered it carefully, his arm steady, his pace unhurried, as though the rope itself were part of the silence that held them all. The lion stirred. His ears twitched at the faint rasp of rope sliding against stone. His body shifted with the heavy pull of fatigue, his forepaw dragging faintly across the wet floor. For an instant, his eyes opened wide, pupils tightening in faint alarm. The rangers froze where they stood, not moving, not speaking. The rope hung still, a line suspended between human intent and animal endurance. Moments stretched thin, like water drawn across stone. The lion's gaze lingered on the dangling shape, measuring it with the instinct of a wild creature. His nostrils flared softly, drawing in the scent, and then he lowered his head again with a long, shuddering breath. His flank trembled as though even that small motion had cost him. The rangers understood. They would not place the rope upon him by force. They would only guide, only offer. One crouched near the edge, his hand outstretched not in reach but in steadying calm. "Easy now," he whispered, the words falling low, almost blending with the drip of water below. The lion shifted again. His body, though drained of strength, held a resilience that spoke of years in the wild. He tried to rise, pressing one paw against the slick floor, but his legs faltered beneath his weight. The rope swayed faintly with his movement, brushing against his shoulder. He startled at the touch, flinching back into the wall, his chest heaving with a rough growl that echoed sharply in the hollow chamber. The sound passed quickly, fading into the damp air. The rangers did not respond in kind. They waited, steady, eyes lowered to soften the tension. The rope was drawn back slightly, not removed, but offered again with patience. Above the drain, the sun slipped behind thin clouds, dimming the light, wrapping the moment in muted tones. Slowly, the lion's breathing steadied. His ears flicked back, then forward again. He blinked, eyes half-lidded, the fire of his alarm settling into watchfulness once more. With a hesitant motion he shifted toward the center of the drain, the tremor of his muscles betraying his weakness. The rope brushed lightly against his side again, this time without sudden recoil. His body accepted it, not fully, but enough for the rangers to know the balance was changing. One ranger moved the rope with infinite care, looping it gently across the lion's shoulder. He did not pull. He simply let it rest, its presence no longer foreign but part of the space they shared. The lion's flank rose and fell, his breathing slow but unbroken, and in his stillness there was a subtle yielding. The others watched closely, their own breaths shallow as though too much sound might undo what was building. The rope settled, drawn across muscle and mane, holding not control, but connection. For long moments, nothing happened, only the faint sound of water below and the lion's breathing above it. Then, with the smallest shift, the lion leaned forward. His paw moved, dragging across the wet stone. The rope followed, guiding but not forcing, a line of trust tested in silence. His body was heavy, each step small, yet he did not resist. The rangers responded only by easing the rope's path, lifting lightly when he faltered, releasing when he steadied himself. Time thickened as the lion inched forward. Each pause felt endless. The weight stretched across heartbeats and patience. The men did not urge him on with noise. They let the silence be the language. The lion's mane brushed against the rope, his sides heaved with effort, and still he moved, guided not by power but by the fragile bond unfolding between wild and human. At last, his head lifted fractionally higher. The rope, no longer a stranger, traced the line of his body as he edged toward the faint promise of air above. The rangers did not cheer, did not quicken. They only steadied their stance, hearts aligned with the rhythm of his slow climb. The lion's paws scraped against stone, his claws catching briefly, his body trembling. Yet the rope held him steady, not dragging, not binding, but offering the strength he could not summon alone. And in that fragile joining of force and respect, the path toward safety began to open. The rangers exchanged the briefest of glances, their faces marked by the quiet knowledge that something rare was happening. The lion, sovereign of the wild, had allowed their presence to shape his steps, not conquered, not broken, simply guided. As he paused once more, sides heaving, the rope lay across him like a thread of trust spun in silence. The men waited, their patience unyielding, as the bond between them deepened with every breath. The drain, once a place of despair, now carried the soft weight of possibility. Above, the wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the promise of open air. And below, the lion leaned again into the rope, his body answering the quiet invitation, one heavy step at a time. The rope held steady, loose enough to honor the lion's strength, firm enough to steady his faltering steps. Each motion seemed drawn from the last reserves of his body, his paws sliding against wet stone, claws scraping briefly before finding no grip. His chest rose sharply with the effort, sides trembling with the weight of each attempt. The rangers above did not rush him. They guided only with the faintest tension, a quiet encouragement through patience rather than pull. The lion shifted forward again, his mane dragging through the damp earth, streaked with mud and broken leaves. His breath came heavy, carrying the deep rasp of fatigue but also a note of persistence. He paused often, head bowed, as though the ground itself were drawing him back. Yet after every stillness came another motion, another step pressed into the dark channel that had trapped him. Above, the men held their ground, careful not to crowd the rim. One whispered softly, "You're almost there," his voice no louder than the brush of grass in the breeze. It was not command but reassurance, a thread cast into the silence between them. The lion's ears flicked faintly at the sound, his eyes narrowing against the dim light above, but his body pressed onward. His forepaw reached higher than before, claws catching the uneven edge of the slope. For a moment he slipped, his weight dragging him back with a dull thud that echoed in the chamber. Mud splashed up around him, streaking his flank. His chest heaved as he lay still, the rope slack at his side, the rangers frozen with quiet concern. Yet slowly, with a groan that seemed torn from the depth of his body, he shifted again. His muscles, though trembling, gathered themselves for another attempt. This time, his claws bit into the edge, holding firm. His shoulders rose, mud sliding from his mane in dark rivulets. He pulled with what strength remained, his hind legs bracing awkwardly against the slick wall. His body shook with effort, each muscle straining against exhaustion. Then, with a surge that seemed impossible after such stillness, his chest cleared the lip of the drain. His head lifted into the open air, mane clinging wet against his face, breath rasping but alive. The rangers stepped back, widening the space, giving him room. They did not touch him, did not crowd him. They only stood in quiet awe as the lion dragged his hindquarters free, his body collapsing onto the grass with a heavy thud. Mud and water clung to him, dripping into the soil, darkening the ground beneath. For a long moment he lay there, unmoving except for the thunder of his breath. The air held still, broken only by the sound of his lungs drawing in what felt like his first full breaths in hours. His tail flicked once, a tremor running the length of his body. Then, slowly, he gathered his legs beneath him. They shook as he pressed upward, his stance unsteady, yet he rose. He staggered, swaying against his own weight, but his head lifted higher, nostrils flaring as the air of the open land rushed into him. The rangers kept their distance, eyes fixed on the miracle of the moment. They had given the rope, the chance, but it was the lion who had chosen to climb, who had decided to rise. His mane, heavy with water, caught the light as the clouds shifted above, scattering brightness across his trembling form. He stood there for several breaths, swaying yet unbroken, his gaze sweeping the open space around him. The wild called to him even through his weakness. Slowly his muscles steadied, his body finding rhythm again after the long silence of the drain. His paws pressed into the grass, each print sinking deep, marking his return to earth not made of stone. The rangers lowered their heads slightly, not as bowing but as a quiet acknowledgement. They did not move closer, did not seek thanks. They only watched, allowing the lion his space, his dignity, his moment of choice. The lion exhaled in a long, steadying breath, a sound that merged with the wind moving through the grass. His body still trembled, yet in his stance was something unmistakable, survival reclaimed. The miracle lay not in the rope, not in the strength of men, but in the lion's final effort, in his decision to rise from darkness and step once more into air and light. The lion stood trembling on unsteady legs, the wet earth clinging to his mane and shoulders. For a long moment he lingered there, caught between collapse and continuation, his breath rising in heavy bursts that fogged faintly in the cooler morning air. His paws pressed into the softened soil, spreading mud between his pads, the impression of his weight marking his return to land that was his own. The rangers kept back, their figures still against the tall grass, waiting in silence. He lowered his head briefly, sides heaving with the strain of muscles not yet ready to bear his full weight. His tail flicked once, then stilled, a faint tremor running the length of his body. Yet he did not sink back to the ground. Instead, he shifted one paw forward. The motion was slow, deliberate, uncertain, but it carried him away from the rim of the drain that had nearly claimed him. The rope lay slack now, no longer guiding, no longer needed. His body told the rest of the story, a will determined to move toward open space. The grass ahead swayed lightly, touched by the first warmth of the sun breaking through thinning clouds. Dew clung to each blade, scattering light in broken fragments. The lion stepped into it, the wetness brushing his legs, darkening his coat further with every contact. His shoulders rolled with the effort, his gait uneven but strengthening with each stride. The earth gave beneath him, softer than stone, yielding in a way that spoke of freedom. The rangers watched closely, but their hands remained at their sides, offering no interruption. Their work was not to lead him farther, only to bear witness. One spoke quietly, hardly more than a breath. "He'll make it now." The words carried no triumph, only quiet certainty, as though naming what they already knew. The lion continued forward, each step longer, surer. His mane, though heavy with mud, lifted faintly with the breeze. His ears twitched toward the rustle of distant birds, toward the sound of grass bending against the wind. His body still bore the mark of exhaustion, ribs visible beneath fur, a stumble in his hind leg, yet with every movement he grew steadier, his form reclaiming rhythm. Behind him, the drain lay open and silent, its darkness retreating into shadow. Where once the sound of shallow breaths had echoed against stone, there was now only the hush of water slipping along its floor. The memory of his stillness remained, but the space was empty of life. The echo of danger had already begun to fade, replaced by the sound of paws pressing into living earth above. The lion's tail swayed once more, this time with a faint lift, no longer trembling, but balanced. He raised his head higher, nostrils wide as he drew in the scent of the open plain. The land spread before him, acacia trees scattered in the distance, the stretch of savanna rolling toward the horizon, the promise of wildness untouched. His steps carried him farther, each stride lifting the remnants of fear from his frame. The rangers remained at the edge of the clearing, their figures still against the tall grass. None followed. None sought more than this moment. Their role was complete, their presence a shadow of care that would not linger beyond what was needed. They had offered rope, patience, and space. The lion had offered his will. Together it had been enough. For a time, the rescuers stood without words, watching the figure move deeper into the grasslands. The lion's back rose against the light, dark and solid even in weakness. His mane shifted with each step, scattering droplets of water into the air until they caught the sun and vanished. His body, once pressed low by exhaustion, now carried itself upright, shoulders lifting with renewed strength. The distance grew. His form became smaller, merging with the waves of grass that bent and swayed. Only the motion of his stride revealed him still, moving, surviving. The silence deepened around the rangers, yet within it was a fullness, the weight of life reclaimed, of witnessing what had nearly been lost but now continued. As he vanished into the horizon, the last trace was the ripple of grass parting in his path, then closing again behind him. The land absorbed his presence, returning him to the wild in quiet grace. The men turned finally, their eyes lingering on the place where he had disappeared. No words followed. Only the wind moved, carrying the sound of grass brushing together. The drain stood empty now, a hollow space marked not by despair but by memory. Above it, the sky stretched open and wide, painted with light. And across the grasslands the lion walked on, whole again, leaving behind silence that would not be forgotten.